Hello and welcome to Full Court Press. This is the second episode of the first season. I'm Michael Lyon, joined again by my friend Yusheng. So last episode, we talked about the Rockets' analytics style of basketball and whether we thought that style was good enough for them to win a championship or whether it was the best style they could have played. And so for this episode, we're going to be focusing more on the rest of the NBA and how that analytics style of shoot a lot of threes and shoot a lot of layups, take away the mid-range shots, how the rest of the NBA has kind of followed that example, followed that formula, and how they've had success with that, and whether it's like the best thing for other teams to do, and whether other teams have had the most success following that type of strategy. So, Yusheng, do you think that other teams should be copying that? And do you think other teams have had success copying that in recent history?
I think it works, first of all, and I think the biggest immediate effect beyond the box score and the stats that you see these days is kind of the rosters of NBA teams and the differences in players. This at the end of this decade in 2020 compared to just 10 years ago in 2010. You see kind of a lot of players that, used to be good, in the older NBA kind of get phased out. Players that are kind of volume scorers that focus on the mid-range, specifically like, maybe a Monte Ellis or like a Brandon Jennings that kind of phased out, bounced around, and kind of came out of the league. And then, you kind of see the rise of other players that have, really fit well in this new league. And one good example is like Robert Covington, right? He's a pretty big three. He shoots a lot of three-pointers, shoots them very well, plays really, really great defense. He's a good two-way player. And, he's big enough size-wise to be able to compete in the post as well. So I think, you see more examples of that across the NBA. And I think that's plenty good evidence to show that teams using advanced analytics are aware of individual player contributions to their team and this new style. So
yeah, I mean, as the three-pointer has become more important, I mean, the Warriors have won a lot and they shoot a lot of threes. The importance of the 3-and-D style of player has become more important too. And I think when you look at a lot of championship quality teams, their role players are all like they look for 3-and-D role players, and you've seen that a lot more frequently. And when you look at a lot of championship contenders, their role players are like 3-and-D style. That's all the Rockets want, I think, really. Talking about the Rockets, because Harden kick out, they want somebody who can just make that open shot and then defend on the other end.
Absolutely. If you look at the Rockets roster, it's kind of more or less kind of the same players, right? Like, you have, Eric Gordon, PJ Tucker. In past iterations, you had like, Trevor Ariza, Chandler Parsons. Even today, you have like Daniel House and Ben McLemore, right? So, they're 3-and-D players, play on both sides of the ball, and they're role players that have a very specific role is to shoot the three-pointer and complement kind of the main piece on the team. And you really see that now on other teams, and other teams are aware of the value of these players, right? Which is why kind of like someone, for instance, like Andre Iguodala, right? He's kind of an older star, and, if you ask anybody, I would say most people would argue that he peaked when he was on the Warriors, right?
That was his finals MVP.
That was his finals MVP year. But if you look at the box score and just, statistics-wise, right, he had more points per game. He was more ball dominant, back when he was on the Sixers and the Nuggets. So with this kind of new analytics revolution, right, with advanced statistics, it's not necessarily kind of the surface level box score numbers, right? And the NBA has been, in my opinion, pretty quick to pick up on that. And a lot of people in the past that, had high usage rates, high points per game, examples kind of like Carmelo Anthony, Carlos Boozer, back to like Brandon Jennings, they've really struggled. A lot of them have kind of bounced around the league and aren't in the league anymore. Or even if, they're not aging stars from the past, kind of like Jahlil Okafor, right? They're struggling to find playing time. And people that don't necessarily stuff up the box score, kind of like Iguodala, who might average, 6.55. They're really kind of showing their value here. And I think NBA teams picked up on the trend rather quickly.
Yeah, so a guy like Andre Iguodala can provide a lot of value to a championship team. I mean, if you look at Klay Thompson is basically a 3-and-D role player. He's just really, really good at it. So like that, I think that style is certainly most valuable. Carmelo Anthony is an interesting kind of counter example that shows why this style change is important and happening and valid, because he was a full out superstar.
He was, and he almost fell from grace overnight, and kind of in his later years, I mean this year with the Blazers and then with the Rockets and Thunder, he tried to change, right, but he wasn't able to adapt quick enough. He tried to kind of adopt 3-point shooting more, Olympic Melo with his outside range, being less kind of ball dominant, improve his defense. And he wasn't able to do so as well. He's doing all right now, arguably on a very, very struggling Blazers team. But overall, he doesn't fit in the modern NBA.
Right. I mean, he's having the best season on the Blazers right now, like the best season in a long time, but he's doing it by trying to adapt to what people say he should do to fit in the modern NBA. He's shooting more threes.
He's playing better defense.
He's focused a lot on his defense, and if you listen to a lot of his interviews and things like he takes it very seriously now. Like he takes it personally that people say he was like a bad defender, and he's really been working on it. And I think, as you'll see, he's having a better, not a great season, but a better season because he's working on the areas that people were criticizing him on before.
And, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have kind of players in the NBA that successfully adapted, and it's done wonders for their career, right? Look at, Brook Lopez kind of adapting kind of the outside shot and his value in Milwaukee, right? Or, you look at Anthony Davis right now, showing more of an outside range with the 3-point ball, and kind of a lot of other players, superstars, even like Chris Paul when he kind of joined the Rockets. We touched on this last episode, shooting more threes. He's continuing to play kind of differently on the Thunder, and LeBron James too. So I think this is something that the entire league has adopted with open arms, and it's just kind of left a few players behind. So.
Yeah, I mean, well, people are doing it. The interesting thing is, though, do you need to do it to win? And I think, based on the teams that have won recently, I think, you kind of do. The teams that are winning are shooting high volumes of threes. And the question that raises is, could the older play styles, even the players that were really good, we were talking about this a little bit before the show, how good would a dominant version of Shaq in his prime be in today's NBA? Is that not as good anymore? And I think that's really interesting because Shaq was arguably the best player in the league for a long time.
Yeah, I think a player like Shaq would kind of struggle a lot more in today's NBA. And this might be a hot take, but I definitely don't think he would be the 5 or 6 time champion that he is, the Hall of Famer with all the stats. Just the play style is different, right? Back then, the Lakers and every team in the league, they had more of a half court offense where you either give the ball to Kobe or you put the ball in the post and watch Shaq go to work, right? And Shaq, luckily he was in a time where that was there, and he fit perfectly, as kind of the stereotypical center. But other players that kind of came after him that aren't as lucky to see their entire careers kind of finish off before the new revolution. A good example is Dwight Howard, right? He used to be dominant in the post, defensively and offensively, right? And he, is no longer the focal point of any offense in the NBA, right? I would argue that.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because if that doesn't work, there's a lot of people that say, oh, Steph could never hang with the players in the 80s because it was a lot more rough and a lot more physical. But if this is the way that the NBA has kind of progressed, it's basically saying, teams like the Rockets and the Warriors have gone up against the Shaq type style and said, well, we're just going to run and shoot and it's going to work, and that's kind of taken over. So if you take that more physical post up style and try to do that now, it seems like it wouldn't work because of the examples Dwight Howard and Carmelo, who have had opportunities in this era where it hasn't worked. So I mean, to me, that kind of says this modern style of basketball is just superior. Like, it's a better way to play.
I wouldn't go maybe that far. It's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. Just comparing different players, different teams across eras is extremely hard.
Right.
And that's why the debate about the greatest player of all time is always going to be there, because it's just almost impossible to compare a player like Chamberlain to a player like Jordan to a player like LeBron, right? It's very difficult.
And and it's interesting because it's not to say that these older players are worse. Like it doesn't say that at all, because they were like equally as dominant in their era. But it's like the style of play might have been worse.
I think part of it is style of play, but just kind of a side topic, just a quick hot take. I think the NBA is constantly getting better. So I'm not talking about specific players, but I think the average NBA player is constantly getting better. And I think the average NBA player this decade will be better than the average NBA player last decade, and so on, right? And you can kind of see that in the 50s and 60s. It was all these just, short white guys playing in the NBA that were like 6 feet tall, right? I mean, that's just kind of, the nature of the game. But with that aside, I do think this new style of play as well just makes more efficiency sense in the long run, and I think it's something that we likely won't go back on. I think we're done seeing games with a score of like maybe 90 to 85 and slow half court grinded out kind of offenses. I think those days are kind of behind us. And I personally, some people might disagree, especially if you grew up watching Jordan, but I think this new style of play is entertaining.
No, I enjoy it a lot. I think it's fun. Like all the fast breaks and alley-oops.
Oh, for sure.
It's fun. It's exciting.
I think it's a good thing for the NBA, and I think a good example of that is back when the Spurs used to win. I say it like it was decades ago, but it was only really 5 or 10 years ago. But their championships, a lot of people argued, were just boring because they played good defense. They weren't some high octane offenses. They just played like a team with very low key stars, and they played good defense, and it was kind of boring. I respect the Spurs as a team, but I feel like teams like the Rockets and the Warriors, in this era, they're very polarizing, but they're very fun to watch.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I agree that it's fun to watch. I think my takeaway is like of the way that things have changed. It's not to say that like the 2017 Warriors would run all over the 86 Bulls or whatever, because like that it's really complicated to compare those players. But my takeaway, I'm not sure everyone would agree with this, but I do think that the Warriors' style of basketball, like the faster paced shooting where you can force a big slow center to switch on a guard, I think that style would dominate the older style of basketball. And I think based on the way things have progressed is kind of evidence of that.
Yeah, I think you're going to make a lot of people mad with that comment, but it's something I completely agree with.
Yeah, and I think so too. But if it wasn't, like if the older style was better, then people will still be doing it and trying to win using it.
I think this is a classic case of, maybe an audience older than us, just thinking back in the good old days and where it's not actually better, right?
Because like sure, things have changed. Like of course things have changed, but it's just like you can't compare the two eras. Like it's hard to compare. Like is Jordan better than LeBron? Well, they played in two different eras, so you'll never know because they'll never play in the same style of basketball. But if you're a franchise trying to win a championship, like the best way to do it is to like fast pace, shoot a lot of threes. Like I think, like basically, I think that would be true even in the 80s. I think
all things being equal, right, which is a lot of qualifiers, that is true. But there are just so many other factors. Who's on your team, who your coaching staff is, right? Like,
yeah, that's true.
What conference are you in, right? Like for instance, if you had a team full of, maybe Kevin Durant and Giannis and Kawhi and so on, right? Like with that team, I would not necessarily play just 3-and-D and kind of in a fast-paced, high-tempo, new analytical style. Maybe that lineup would work in a more traditional style, right? Because the personnel you have doesn't fit necessarily the mold.
I see what you're saying.
But all in all, I agree with you.
Let's put it like if you were a GM in the 80s and like the good old style of basketball, and you're trying to win a championship, I still think it would be best to try to acquire a lot of shooters.
Yeah, but look at the 80s and look at now, right? I think a lot of the reasoning that, kind of what we have today works is because you have more people with the ability to shoot three-pointers. In the 80s, even the best three-point shooters were not shooting them in high volume, and they were not as good of a shooter as the present day and modern day Steph Curry or James Harden or Kyle Korver, right?
Well, that makes sense. But if they were capable of that,
if they had the personnel in the 80s,
it would
this
still
style
be
would
the best way.
I agree. But definitely the personnel has changed, over time. So
well, it's progressed towards a way that allows them to play the best style of basketball. I think when eras change, it's like making progress towards like playing the game better, like towards playing a style that's more capable of winning basketball games.
If we extend kind of the timeline, right? Let's say the NBA existed for another 200 years, right? The league as a whole and teams would always deviate towards a better way to play the game with higher efficiency, right? Why would you? I mean, there's clearly ups and downs, but your general trajectory is towards optimization, right?
Yeah. So like in the same sense, like I would think that however they play 20 years from now, most likely will be better than the style of play we have now.
I completely agree with that. So, and I think
it's just really interesting because a lot of people say like, "Oh no, they're just different eras, so you can't compare them." Like it's just different. Like they're not
progression.
One's not better. They're just different. But I think it is progression, or else it would the progression would never happen.
I agree there, and I think what's more special, I guess, about this decade than prior decades is that progression has always been happening, but it's been so much more evident because of kind of how explosive this change was, right? You had progression, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but I think, the adoption of kind of volume three-point shooting and the way we see teams kind of prioritize advanced analytics now, that was adopted between 2015 and 2018 extremely quickly, which is what makes it so much more obvious and evident, and which is why you see kind of players struggling to adapt to a new era, right? Which is why you see a situation such as Carmelo kind of fall from grace so quickly. So
yeah, and it's interesting because they're you look at like Carmelo is trying to adapt. Like it's a struggle for these players to keep up. And that's just the way it's just an obstacle they have to face.
Oh yeah, for sure. But like I said, for every struggling star, there's another kind of role player. Going back to the Covington example, he was actually undrafted. He was on the G League team of the Rockets, and I think the Rockets either traded him or waived him eventually, and he played on the Sixers team that was undergoing the process, right? Yeah. So that's how little he was valued at that time in the early 2010s in the league, to now signing a huge multi-year contract and being kind of like a highly coveted 3-and-D guard, right?
Yeah,
or small forward.
I think now he's viewed more of an asset that could be
a huge asset,
big contributor on a championship quality team.
So I think for every one of those Carmelo, Carlos Boozer, Jennings stories, there's another one of those Brooke Lopez or Covington stories that kind of balances things out. So.
Yeah. One more point I think that's interesting is you'll see players, not as common, like it's uncommon that you'll see young players try to like emulate that style of like the way Carmelo played in his prime. But I'm a big Celtics fan, and Jason Tatum's received a lot of criticism for shooting a lot of mid-range shots and for like copying Kobe. A lot of people put it like he shouldn't try to be like Kobe and shouldn't take like contested mid-range shots. And trying to like watching him thrive and try to decide his best style of play is really interesting because it's like him trying to balance that, where his instincts might tell him to shoot those shots a lot, but he might understand that's not going to be the most efficient way for him to play. And it's interesting trying to see him adapt to the way the game has changed, even if it might go against his instincts a little bit. And I think he's doing a pretty good job. He's having a good season this year, but on low shooting percentage. And so I wonder if that will continue to be a concern with him.
I think that's very interesting. I think trends are still just trends, so it's kind of a generalization of kind of the direction of the league and teams and the average player, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily completely erasing the mid range or every single player in the league having to completely change. I think if he's, good enough to where he shows that he can still add more value from the mid-range individually, him as a player than, the average NBA player, and he does it better than he would from the three-point line, then maybe he can go on with that play style. But personally, I'd rather flow with the current than against it. So
right. And another thing is like if defenses start to over adapt to like focusing on guarding the three and the layup, then maybe there'll be more mid-range shots that are open.
For sure,
that you could try to take advantage of.
Yeah, it's a game three, right? Like as soon as defenses all start just focusing on the three and inside shots, maybe mid-range defense starts loosening up a bit, and then the expected point value of that mid-range jump shot increases enough to where
it's worth taking again. Yeah.
Once again worth pursuing. So well, we'll see where the league takes us, and what the NBA is going to look like in a few more years. So
yeah, I think that about wraps up episode 2 of season 1 of Moreyball that we're doing. Thanks, Yusheng, for coming on again.
And once again, if you guys have any kind of counter commentary or dissenting opinions, feel free to give us an earful. So
yeah, I'm definitely open to hearing and talking about it more.